The wind combed through the dry grass around the cemetery perched on the hill above Dusty Fork, and Elise Kruger knelt in the raw dirt with her skirt stained by milk and grief. Her fingers dug into the fresh mound of earth that covered her baby's grave, the soil still loose and dark from the burial 3 days prior. A rough wooden cross leaned at the head, the name Johann carved into it by a miner with a dull knife and an unsteady hand that had tried its best to show respect. Her breath came in shallow, shaking pulls that burned in her chest. The town below was a blur of weathered boards and chimney smoke dust devils and the distant clang of the stamp mill. But up here there was only the grave, and the sky bleeding orange and red as the sun began its descent toward the jagged horizon. The air smelled of sage and something bitter she could not name, something that tasted like ash on her tongue. Hoofbeats rattled along the fence line, sharp and deliberate against the packed earth. Elise did not look up at first. Men had ridden past before, laughing and firing at headstones for sport, treating the dead like targets at a shooting gallery. She hugged herself tighter, hoping to become invisible against the dirt and shadows, just another grieving widow the world had forgotten. Instead of drunken whoops, there was only the creak of leather and the soft thud of boots hitting the ground. A shadow fell across her, long and dark, blocking the last rays of sunlight. She looked up slowly, adrenaline surging through her veins. An Apache warrior stood just inside the fence, tall and lean, in a worn buckskin shirt and army surplus trousers that had seen better days. Long dark hair hung loose past his shoulders, no longer adorned with the feathered war bonnet his people had once worn openly. His face was cut with hard lines, and sun the kind of face that had seen too much and survived it anyway, marked by smallpox scars along his left cheek. But his eyes were steady and intelligent, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. In his arms, wrapped in a coarse blanket that smelled of wood smoke and sagebrush, a baby cried, a hoarse, furious sound that cut through the silence like a knife through cloth. Behind him, on the ridge to the east, several riders from Dusty Fork appeared, rifles balanced across their saddles, searching the landscape with the lazy menace of men who believed they owned everything they could see. The wind carried their voices rough and impatient, punctuated by curses. The warrior crossed the few yards between them in 3 long strides, knelt and pressed the squirming bundle into Elise's arms. His hands were rough but careful, and she felt the heat of his skin through the blanket, the calluses of a man who lived by his strength. "Hold him," he said quietly. His English accented but clear, each word deliberate, and waited. "If they see me with the child, they will not ask questions. They will shoot first and call it justice after." Before she could protest or even understand what was happening, he drew her and the baby into his chest, his arms wrapping around both of them in an embrace that was neither tender nor romantic, but purely tactical. To the riders on the ridge, silhouetted against the sunset, they looked like a grieving husband and wife clinging together beside a grave, holding their child close against the coming night. Dust swirled around them in a small whirlwind, stinging her eyes. The baby's cries quieted slightly against the warmth of their bodies. Elise could feel the warrior's heart pounding against her cheek, as hard and fast as her own. She held her breath, counting the seconds, waiting. After a long, tense moment that stretched like wire about to snap, the riders cursed loudly enough for the sound to carry on the wind. One of them spat tobacco juice and laughed at something crude. They turned their horses and thundered back toward town, satisfied they had seen nothing but grief and shadows and the kind of scene that happened every day in a hard land. Elise was left cradling a stranger's child, held in the iron circle of a man she had never met. Her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The sun dipped below the mountains, and the world turned cold. When the warrior finally released her, she felt the absence of his warmth like a physical loss. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Chato," he said. "And you are the woman who would not look away when a Mexican boy was being beaten at the well. I need that woman now. 3 weeks earlier, on a bright morning in late September of 1878, Elise had stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Fork with a battered carpetbag and a letter folded carefully in her pocket. The letter promised a farm, a house, and a future. It was signed by Walter Kruger, a German immigrant who worked in the Kensington silver mine, and wrote in stiff, hopeful English about building something good in the New Mexico territory, far from the crowded streets of New York and the memories of the old country that still haunted both of them. The reality was harder and sharper than any letter could convey. The farm turned out to be a patch of scrub near the slag heaps, with a lean-to built of warped boards and a roof that leaked when it rained. Walter was kind but exhausted, a man with calloused hands and tired eyes, who owed half his soul to Lars Kensington, the mine owner, who also controlled the freight line, the telegraph office, and most of Main Street. Kensington was a big man with soft hands and a voice like honey poured over gravel, and everyone in town knew better than to cross him. Elise and Walter married quickly, in a ceremony presided over by a circuit preacher who smelled of whiskey and spoke in a monotone that suggested he had given up on the idea of love long ago. They made the best of what they had. Walter worked long shifts in the dark tunnels beneath the earth, and Elise tried to turn the lean-to into something resembling a home. She scrubbed the floors until her hands bled planted vegetables in soil that barely held water, and learned to stretch $1 farther than she ever thought possible. On the ship from Bremen, during the crossing that had taken 6 weeks of rough seas and sickness, Elise had befriended a young woman named Anna Holtz. Anna traveled with her husband Friedrich and their infant son, a chubby baby, with bright eyes and a ready smile. They had shared bread and stories during the crossing, and Anna had written Elise's name and Walter's on a scrap of paper, tucking it into a tin box with a brooch her grandmother had given her, in case we are separated. Anna had said in German, her eyes serious, "You are like sister now. If something happens, you know who we are. You'll remember us." Elise had laughed at the time, thinking it melodramatic. But Anna had insisted, and Elise had written her own information in return, pressing it into Anna's hand. They had been separated in New York, swept into different crowds at the immigration station. The Holtz family had headed west on a different route, chasing their own dreams. Elise had not seen Anna again, though she thought of her often, wondering if she had found what she was looking for. Their son was born in the middle of winter, small and fragile. They named him Johann, after Walter's father, a man who had died in the Prussian wars and left nothing but stories and a single medal that Walter kept wrapped in cloth. Johann cried weakly and struggled to nurse. Elise held him for hours, willing him to grow stronger, singing lullabies her own mother had taught her. But the baby remained frail. The water from the town well ran cloudy and strange, after Kensington opened a new shaft upriver, closer to the headwaters. Dr. Samuel Pike, the overworked town doctor with kind eyes and a perpetual frown, warned Kensington about contamination in a public meeting. Kensington had smiled and called it natural mineral content. In front of the town council, his voice smooth and dismissive. "Dr. Pike worries too much," Kensington had said, and the council had laughed because they were on his payroll. But Pike had pulled Elise aside afterward, his face gray with worry. "Boil the water," he had said quietly. "Every drop. Promise me." She had promised, but sometimes exhaustion won, and she forgot, and Johann drank from the cup she gave him without question. Walter died before Johann did. A timber in the lower gallery broke on a Tuesday afternoon in early September, crushing his chest and killing him instantly. 3 other men were injured, but Walter was the only one who did not come home. Kensington called it a tragedy of the rock, and paid for a cheap coffin made of green pine that warped in the sun. He did not pay the wages he still owed Walter from the previous month, claiming the paperwork had been lost in a fire that no one else remembered seeing. Elise had gone to his office to demand payment, her voice shaking with grief and rage. Kensington had looked at her with those soft, calculating eyes and said, "Your husband signed a contract, Mrs. Kruger. All debts were forgiven upon death. It's standard practice. You should be grateful for the coffin." She had wanted to scream to throw something, but she had only nodded and walked out, her hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. Johann followed his father 2 weeks later. The baby simply stopped breathing one night, his small body cold by morning. Dr. Pike did what he could, which was nothing, and refused payment for the visit. His face was gray when he told her what she already knew, and he had gripped her hand briefly before leaving. "I'm sorry," he had said, and she believed him. Elise's only true friends became Dr. Pike and Mary O'Rourke, the Irish schoolteacher, who helped immigrants write letters and read contracts. Mary was sharp-tongued and fierce with red hair she kept pinned in a practical bun and a habit of saying exactly what she thought, consequences be damned. She saw how Elise, even in fresh grief, stepped between a drunk cowboy and a terrified Mexican boy at the pump one afternoon, taking a shove meant for the child without flinching. The cowboy had laughed, his breath reeking of rot-gut whiskey. "You got a death wish, woman." "I have a conscience," Elise had replied, her voice cold. "You should try finding one." He had walked away muttering about uppity foreigners. But Mary had seen the iron in Elise's spine. "There's steel under that plain dress," Mary said afterward, and Elise did not know whether to be proud or ashamed. Out beyond the town, in the dry hills and canyons where the Apache still moved like ghosts through land that had once been theirs alone, Chato followed a different trail. He was a warrior in his early 30s, a man who sometimes scouted for the army when it suited him, and vanished into the desert when it did not. His people were scattered, hunted, and desperate, but they had not surrendered their dignity or their knowledge of the land. Chato's face bore the marks of smallpox he had survived as a boy, and his hands were scarred from 100 small battles and skirmishes with soldiers and settlers alike. Along the rail line, children had begun to disappear. Apache children, Mexican children, poor white children. It made no difference to whoever was taking them. The pattern was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as runaways or accidents. But Chato noticed. A family would report a missing daughter, and the authorities would shrug. A boy would vanish on his way to fetch water, and no one would investigate. The territorial government was understaffed and uninterested in the problems of people who could not vote or pay taxes. When Chato's own niece, a girl of 7 named Nasha, vanished near Crow Wing while gathering piñon nuts with her grandmother, his hunt became personal. He tracked the rumors and the trails, piecing together fragments of a terrible truth that most people refused to see. There was a business in stolen children, a trade that moved them like cattle to work camps and mines, where no one asked questions and no one kept records that could be traced. He found the burned wagon in a dry arroyo, 3 days' ride from Dusty Fork, hidden in a draw where the buzzards circled in lazy spirals. 2 adults had been shot at close range and left to rot in the sun, and their bodies bloated and black with decay. A teenage boy lay nearby, still breathing, but barely his chest torn open by buckshot. Chato knelt beside him and gave him water from his canteen, tilting the boy's head gently. "Orphan train?" the boy whispered in English, blood bubbling on his lips with each word. "They changed the route. Kensington, he paid them to bring us here instead. We were supposed to go to Santa Fe. Family's waiting. But he wanted workers. Cheap, no questions." The boy coughed a wet, rattling sound and died before he could say more. Chato closed the boy's eyes and said a brief prayer in Apache, asking the spirits to guide him home. In a wicker basket tucked beneath the wagon's seat, hidden under a torn blanket, Chato found an infant, red-faced and screaming, wrapped in a blanket embroidered with flowers. The child was dehydrated but alive, and there was a tin box beside him containing a brooch, a lock of hair, and a scrap of paper with names written in a woman's careful hand. The tracks around the wagon, still visible in the dry earth, pointed toward the freight road that led to Dusty Fork and the network of mines that surrounded it. Chato could not safely carry a white baby into his own camp, which was already under surveillance by the army. The soldiers would use it as an excuse to raid, to accuse, to kill indiscriminately. He needed someone in town to shelter the child, while he traced the men behind the trade and gathered proof that could not be ignored. Mary O'Rourke, the Irish schoolteacher, who had once helped him send a message to his sister on a reservation, had mentioned a widow who would plant her boots and take a hit for a stranger. A woman with more courage than sense. So he brought the baby to the hill, to the cemetery where the grieving went, and to the woman who had lost everything. Back at the cemetery fence, once the riders were gone, and the dust had settled into the twilight, the warrior slowly loosened his hold. Elise's cheek was still pressed against his chest, and she could feel his heart hammering as hard as her own, the rhythm gradually slowing as the danger passed. The baby squirmed between them, crying again, now that the immediate threat had faded, his small voice piercing the quiet. "Whose child is this?" Elise whispered, her voice hoarse from grief and fear and something else she could not name. "White wagon burned?" Chato answered, pulling back just enough to meet her eyes. His gaze was direct and unflinching, the kind of look that demanded truth in return. 2 adults dead. 1 boy dying. He told me they were heading for the orphan train that runs through Crow Wing families waiting in Santa Fe. Someone took the wrong freight and tried to cover it with fire. He nodded toward the town below, where lanterns were beginning to flicker in windows like distant stars. "Your mine owner handles the wagons." His name was in the boy's last words. The baby squalled louder, a sound of pure need and fury. And Elise's body still not fully healed from Johann's birth. And death responded with a painful rush of milk that soaked through the fabric of her dress. She bit down on a sob, pressing her hand to her chest, the ache both physical and emotional. "They will say I stole him." The warrior continued, his voice low and urgent, each word measured. "They already look for me. Last week I was seen near the rail line, and they put out word that Apache are raiding again, stealing and killing. It is a lie, but it is a useful lie for men who do not want questions asked." His eyes searched hers, weighing her strength and her willingness. "Will you keep him a few days while I find proof they cannot ignore or burn?" Elise looked down at the stranger's child in her arms. His face was scrunched and red, his fists waving in the air like tiny weapons against a world that had already hurt him. He was alive and loud and real. And for the first time since Johann's death, she felt something other than the hollow ache that had consumed her. An hour ago, her world had been empty and cold, a void that threatened to swallow her whole. Now there was weight in her arms again, warm and demanding and impossible to ignore. "If you are wrong," she said, her voice shaking but her eyes steady, "they will hang me for it. They will say I conspired with the Apache to steal a white child, and they will not give me a trial. They will just put a rope around my neck and call it justice." "If I am wrong," he replied, his voice softening slightly, "you can hand him to their sheriff yourself, and I will not stop you. I will even turn myself in if it saves you. But I am not wrong. This child was taken and others with him. And the man who did it is rich and protected and believes he can do anything without consequence." She thought of Kensington's smooth voice and soft hands, the way he had dismissed her claim for Walter's wages without a second thought. She thought of Walter's crushed body in the coffin that had warped in the sun because Kensington was too cheap to buy seasoned wood. She thought of the cloudy water that had killed her son, the water Kensington refused to fix because admitting fault would cost him money and reputation. Then she nodded, a single sharp motion that felt like stepping off a cliff. "Take us home," she said, "before someone changes his mind and rides back to check." The warrior's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained watchful, constantly scanning the darkening landscape. He rose smoothly and helped her to her feet with a hand under her elbow. His touch was careful, respectful, as if he understood that she was fragile, in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. "My name is Chato," he said, his voice formal. "My people call me by another name, but Chato is what the whites can say." "Elise," she replied. "Elise Kruger." "I know," he said, and something in his tone suggested that Mary O'Rourke had told him more than just her name. They walked down the hill together in the gathering dark, the baby crying between them, two strangers bound by a single desperate choice, and the beginning of something neither of them could yet name or understand. The moonlit dust beneath their feet glowed faintly, and the stars began to emerge one by one, cold and distant witnesses. They could not simply stroll into Dusty Fork with an Apache warrior walking beside a white widow in full view. The sight would draw questions, guns, and a rope before anyone bothered to listen or think. Chato wrapped a blanket around his shoulders like a serape, pulled a wide-brimmed hat low over his face, and walked on the shaded side of Elise's small wagon as if he were just another hired hand or drifter passing through town in search of work or whiskey. At the edge of town, near the livery stable where the smell of manure and hay hung thick and sweet in the air, Deputy Yale Cutter stepped out from the shadows between two buildings. He was a lean man in his 40s, with a narrow face and eyes that missed nothing, a man who survived by knowing which way the wind blew and adjusting his sails accordingly before the storm hit. One hand rested casually on the butt of his Colt revolver, a weapon he kept clean and oiled with the care of a man who knew his life might depend on it. "Evening, Mrs. Kruger," he said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who enjoyed his authority, but was smart enough not to abuse it unnecessarily. "Town says you were up at the graveyard again." His gaze flicked to the blanket in her arms, and his eyes narrowed with suspicion and something that might have been concern. "You've got another little one already. That's mighty quick work for a widow in mourning." Elise's throat tightened, her pulse jumping in her neck like a trapped bird. Her mind raced, scrambling for a lie that would hold up under scrutiny and the inevitable gossip that would follow. "A cousin's child," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady and her eyes to meet his without flinching or looking away. Their wagon broke an axle heading north toward Santa Fe. They're laid up near Whispering Pines with a busted wheel, and the mother's ill with fever. I'm minding him until they're fit to travel again. Shouldn't be more than a week or so. Yale considered her, his jaw working, as if he were chewing on the story to see if it tasted right or if it had the sour flavor of a lie. Behind him, the saloon's piano clanged out a crooked tune, and laughter spilled into the street, along with the smell of tobacco smoke and cheap whiskey that burned going down. Black Jack Morrison, Kensington's foreman and chief enforcer, lounged in the doorway of the Silver Strike Saloon, watching with hooded eyes and a smile that never reached his face. He was a big man, over 6 feet tall, with scarred knuckles and a reputation for violence that kept most men quiet and compliant. Black Jack had killed 2 men in bar fights over card games, beaten a dozen more into submission for various offenses, real and imagined, and everyone knew he did Kensington's dirty work without question or conscience. He was the kind of man who enjoyed his work a little too much, who smiled when he hurt people. "Best stay off the mine road," Yale muttered finally, waving her through with a flick of his hand, though his eyes lingered on the bundle in her arms. Men are riled after that accident with Kruger and the others. Some of them are drinking heavy and looking for someone to blame. They might not stop to ask who you're kin to before they decide your trouble. He did not look at Chato, and Chato did not lift his head or make eye contact. Elise felt him exhale slowly beside her as they moved past the deputy and deeper into town. and the wheels of the wagon creaking on the rutted street, each sound loud in the tense silence. In her lean-to, little more than 4 walls and a roof that leaked in the corners, she laid the baby, whom she started calling Jonas, just to have a name to speak aloud. On the only clean quilt she owned a wedding gift from a neighbor who had since moved away. Chato checked the shutter on the single window, testing its strength, and then examined the gap under the door and the line of sight from the street. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had spent his life one step ahead of danger, his eyes cataloging every weakness in the structure, every potential entry point for enemies. "You need a doctor," Elise said, watching Jonas's face turn red as he cried. His skin was hot to the touch, burning with fever, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. "He's burning up. If we don't get help, he might not make it through the night. A white doctor will talk." Chato replied, his voice flat, and certain the tone of a man who had learned hard lessons about trust. "He will tell Kensington's men, and they will come. They will take the child and put me in chains, or more likely just shoot me and say I resisted." Not this one. Her voice hardened with conviction, with the memory of a man who had sat with her through the longest night of her life. "Dr. Pike sat with my boy until the sun came up. He didn't mention payment once, didn't make me feel like I owed him. He held Johann while I slept, so I could rest for just an hour without being afraid he would stop breathing. If you don't trust him, trust me." Chato studied her for a long moment, weighing the risk against the child's need, calculating the odds in his head. Then he nodded once, a sharp motion. "Go. I watch the door. If anyone comes who is not the doctor, I will know, and I will leave through the back. You will say I forced you, held a knife to your throat. You will be believed." "I won't say that," Elise said quietly. "You will, if you want to live." Chato replied, and there was no emotion in his voice, only pragmatism born of long survival. Elise wrapped Jonas tightly against the cooling night air and slipped out into the darkness, moving quickly through the back alleys toward Dr. Pike's surgery on the far side of Main Street, away from the saloons and the noise. Dr. Pike examined Jonas in his cramped surgery, his brow furrowed with concentration as he worked by the light of 2 oil lamps. The room smelled of carbolic acid and old blood medicinal herbs, and the faint copper tang of instruments that had been used and cleaned too many times. The lamplight cast long shadows across the walls, lined with bottles and instruments, creating a space that felt both safe and precarious. "Lungs are clear enough," Pike said, pressing his stethoscope to the baby's chest and listening intently, his eyes unfocused as he concentrated on the sounds within. Fevers from the shock and the dust, probably dehydration from crying and not nursing properly. He'll live if he gets clean water and milk, which is not a common thing in this town anymore, not since that bastard opened the new shaft. His mouth twisted with bitterness that had been building for months. "I told them. I told the council, I told Kensington to his face, and they laughed at me." When Elise mentioned a burned wagon near Crow Wing, giving him the details Chato had shared, Pike went very still. He set down his instruments carefully, as if they might break, and opened a drawer in his desk. He pulled out a folded railroad circular, stamped with the date from several weeks earlier, the paper yellowed and worn from being handled repeatedly. It was a notice of an orphan train passing through the territory, with a handwritten note in his own cramped scrawl along the margin. "Inspected children at platform Crow Wing, 1 infant with crescent birthmark on left hip, appears healthy, good color. Holtz family." "Lift his blanket?" Pike said quietly, his voice tight with something that might have been dread. Elise did, her hands shaking slightly. On Jonas's pale skin just above the left leg, where it met his small hip, lay a small dark crescent-shaped birthmark, distinct and unmistakable, exactly as Pike had described. "Mein Gott." Elise whispered in German, the language of shock and prayer. "I saw this child. Pike murmured, his voice thick with anger and something that might have been guilt to the weight of knowledge he had not acted upon. On the platform at Crow Wing 3 weeks ago. I was there to check a miner's broken arm at the rail stop. Kensington's freight men were supposed to move that group to ranchers north of here, families who had contracted for workers and orphans needing homes through the Children's Aid Society. Legal placements papers signed. Couple of days later, the railroad telegraphed that several youngsters never arrived at their destinations. 5 children just gone. Kensington blamed bandits, and Apache raids made a big show of offering sympathy. His mouth twisted into something ugly. Funny thing, though, no bullet holes in the wagons that came back to town. No blood, just new chains in the freight room bolted to the floor, and a smell like children had been kept in there too long, like livestock in a pen. Elise felt a cold weight settle in her stomach, heavy as stone, spreading through her limbs. Walter told me once, she said, slowly piecing together fragments of memory that had seemed meaningless at the time, that Kensington had him haul boxes through an old ventilation shaft that connected to the lower tunnels, the ones they closed off after the cave-in 2 years ago. He said he didn't like the work because the boxes whimpered and cried when he moved them. Walter thought it was his imagination, the dark playing tricks on his mind. But he refused to do it again, and Kensington cut his wages the next week. Walter never made the connection, but I think he knew something was wrong. Pike's face went pale, the blood draining away, until he looked like a ghost in the lamplight. If that's true, then this is bigger than one missing baby. This is a system organized and deliberate. Kensington is selling children to whoever will pay no questions asked. On her way home, driven by a fury she barely understood and could not contain, Elise stopped at Kensington's office despite the late hour. The building was the finest in town, with glass windows imported from St. Louis and a polished wooden door that gleamed even in the moonlight. Light showed through the windows, and she could see Kensington inside, still working despite the hour, always working, because money never slept. She knocked hard, not caring if she seemed desperate or deranged. Kensington opened the door himself, his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, looking irritated at the interruption. "Mrs. Kruger," he said, his voice smooth as oil poured over water. "It's rather late for a social call. I want Walter's wages." She said, her voice sharper than she intended, all the grief and rage of the past weeks crystallizing into this single demand. "The ones you still owe him. I need that money." Kensington sighed and gestured her inside, leading her to his massive desk of dark wood. He leafed through a freight ledger crowded with neat figures and calculations, and as he did, Elise's eyes caught on entries labeled "Special Cargo" with initials instead of goods listed. JR and EM and TH. Just initials paired with destinations written only as cryptic abbreviations: SB Mine Lower Tunnel, RH Canyon Private, WM Freight Hold. The handwriting was precise, deliberate, the kind of record a careful man kept to protect himself and cover his tracks. "As I told you before," Kensington said, not looking up from the ledger, "your husband's account was settled upon his death. All debts forgiven as per the contract he signed when he took employment. Grief confuses the eyes, Mrs. Kruger. Best leave freight matters to those who understand them." But as he spoke, Elise memorized what she could see, the initials, the abbreviations, the way he kept a separate column, marked with a small symbol that looked like a keyhole. She did not know what it meant, but she knew it was important. Kensington noticed her gaze and slammed the ledger shut with a sharp crack that made her jump. "Good evening, Mrs. Kruger," he said, his tone dismissive and final, and he stood to show her out. She left, but the image of those entries burned in her mind like a brand. Back at the lean-to, she found Chato holding Jonas against his bare chest, letting the baby hear the slow, steady beat of his heart. The child's crying had faded to soft hiccups and exhausted sighs, his small body finally relaxing. It was a technique Chato's people used to calm infants, grounding them in the rhythm of life itself, a practice passed down through generations and taught to him by his grandmother. "You trust that doctor," Chato said, not looking up from the baby's face, his voice soft in the darkness. What did he see? He saw this boy before? Elise answered and told him everything: the birthmark, the orphan train, the missing children, the ledger entries with their cryptic symbols, the way Kensington had shut the book like closing a coffin lid. Chato's jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath his skin. "Then it is as I feared," he said. "Your dead husband almost dug out their tunnel. Now they use it to slide children under the law, where no one can see and no one asks questions. And they keep records to protect themselves if someone more powerful ever asks." That night, with Jonas sleeping fitfully in a wooden box by the stove, wrapped in the quilt Elise had made for Johann, with hands that had since held so much loss, Chato took Elise outside behind the lean-to. The air was cool and sharp, the kind of cold that cut through thin fabric, and the stars, scattered across the sky like salt spilled on black cloth, impossibly bright and distant. He did not hand her Walter's old Colt revolver first. Instead, he stood in front of her in the moonlit dust, his expression serious and intent, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "When fear comes," he said, his voice low and steady, each word carefully chosen, "your hands shake, your eyes narrow, your throat closes. You forget the air." He touched his own chest over his heart, the gesture almost ritual. "You must make the body obey anyway, or the fear wins and you die. Fear is useful, but only if you control it." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body in the cold air, and placed one hand lightly on her lower ribs, the other on her back, just below her shoulder blades. The contact was startling intimate, in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival and trust. Elise felt her face flush, despite the cold, but she did not pull away, because she understood somehow that this was important, that her life might depend on this lesson. "Breathe here," he instructed, his voice low and rhythmic, like a chant, slow and deep, not up in your throat where it can choke you and make you weak. From the belly where the strength lives. He demonstrated his chest rising and falling in a measured cadence that seemed impossibly calm. "In for 4, hold for 2, out for 4. This is how my people steady themselves before the hunt, before the fight. My grandmother taught me when I was a boy and afraid of the dark. It is old knowledge." She stood like that while he counted in Apache, low and steady, the numbers foreign, but the rhythm universal. She learned to draw in air for 4 beats, hold it for 2, let it out for 4. The world narrowed to the warmth of his hands, and the rhythm of his voice, the sound of crickets in the grass, and the distant howl of a coyote marking its territory. Her breathing smoothed, and with it the panicked fluttering of her heart slowed to something manageable. Only when she was calm, when her pulse had slowed and her hands had stopped shaking, did he put Walter's old revolver into her grip and show her how to align the sights, how to stand with her weight balanced, how to squeeze the trigger rather than pull it. The gun was heavy and cold, unfamiliar in her hand, smelling of old gun oil and metal. "The shot begins long before the trigger," he said, guiding her arms into position with careful touches that were purely instructive. "If you can command your breath, you can command the bullet. The body and the weapon must be one, or you waste the shot and die anyway." She did not know then that he was planting the memories she would cling to when everything broke and the world turned to blood and chaos. As Elise practiced her breathing and stance, the Colt growing slightly less foreign in her hands, Ito began to speak, his voice quiet and distant, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere deep inside. My niece Nasha was 7 winters old, he said, staring out at the dark horizon where the mountains were black shapes against the stars. She had a laugh like water running over stones, bright and clear. She was learning to weave baskets from her grandmother, learning the patterns that tell stories. One day she went to fetch water from the spring near Crow Wing, just a short walk from camp. We thought it was safe because the soldiers had moved north. She did not come back. He paused, his jaw tight enough that Elise could see the muscle jumping. We searched for 2 weeks. Found her dress torn and caught on a mesquite bush, blood on the thorns. Nearby were wagon tracks heading south, not north where the reservation was. The soldiers said she ran away. The agent said, "Apache children do that, go wild and vanish back into the desert." He laughed when he said it like it was a joke. His voice hardened into something cold and brittle. But I know the difference between a child who runs and a child who is taken. I have tracked both. The patterns are different, and I know what a struggle looks like in the dirt. Elise lowered the gun slowly, looking at him in the moonlit darkness. His face was a mask of controlled pain, the kind that never fully healed. "I'm sorry." She said the words inadequate but sincere, carrying the weight of her own loss. "Do not be sorry," Chado replied, his voice rough. "Help me find who took her and the others like her. That is worth more than sorrow. Sorrow is useless. Action is everything." Over the next 3 days, as Jonas slowly grew stronger under Elise's careful nursing and the clean water Dr. Pike provided from his own, Mary O'Rourke began asking quiet questions around town. She moved carefully to avoid suspicion, speaking to parents in low voices in their homes, after dark, writing down their stories in a small notebook she kept hidden in her apron pocket, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from rain and searching hands. A Mexican farmhand named Miguel Herrera told her about his daughter Elena. She was hanging laundry, he said in Spanish, his weathered hands shaking as he spoke, and Mary translated in her mind as she wrote. One moment she is there singing a song her mother taught her, the next moment gone. I looked everywhere, senora. Everywhere. The sheriff, he says she run away with a boy, but Elena is only 9 years old. She has no boy. She has only her family and her chores and her prayers. An Apache woman whose son, 2 horses, had worked at the livery, spoke through her sister who knew English. He was a good boy, she said, her voice flat with grief that had turned to stone. He did not drink the white man's whiskey. He did not gamble. He worked hard and sent money to his mother on the reservation. One day he does not come home. The white man at the livery says he stole a horse and ran. But my nephew would never steal. It is not his way. A white homesteader, a woman whose hands were cracked from hard work, told Mary about her daughter Sarah. She was walking to school just 2 miles down the road, the woman said, her voice breaking. Her brother saw a wagon stop, saw men talking to her. Then they were gone. My husband tracked them to the mine road, but then the tracks disappeared on the hard ground. No one would help us look. They said she probably got lost in the desert, that we should pray. The pattern was undeniable once someone cared enough to look. Children with no powerful families, no protection, no one to raise an alarm loud enough to matter or force the law to act. The kind of children the world would not miss, or so someone believed. Blackjack Morrison noticed Mary's questions because he made it his business to know everything that happened in Dusty Fork. He cornered her outside the schoolhouse one afternoon when the children had gone home and the street was quiet. His bulk blocked the sun and cast her in shadow, and she could smell the tobacco and sweat on him and the scent of a man who cared nothing for cleanliness or civility. "You're asking a lot of questions, Miss O'Rourke," he said, his voice carrying a lazy threat, the tone of a man who enjoyed intimidation. Poking your nose into things that ain't your concern might be healthier if you stopped. Folks might start thinking you're stirring up trouble where there ain't none, and that's a dangerous reputation for a woman alone. Mary looked him in the eye, without flinching, her Irish temper flaring hot and bright. Might be healthier if you told the truth for once in your miserable life. She replied, her voice sharp as broken glass, each word precise and cutting. But I suppose that would require you to have a conscience, and we both know you sold yours to Kensington years ago. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only menace and the promise of violence. Truth is whatever Mr. Kensington says it is, schoolteacher. You'd do well to remember that if you want to keep teaching, or keep breathing for that matter. The next day, the school board, composed entirely of men on Kensington's payroll, who owed their positions to his money and influence, fired Mary. They called her a troublemaker and unsuitable for the moral education of children, ordering her to leave town within 24 hours or face arrest for disturbing the peace. But Mary O'Rourke did not scare easily. She moved into a cot behind Dr. Pike's surgery, instead defiant, and unbowed her red hair like a flag of rebellion, and continued gathering statements. She stored them in a biscuit tin under the floorboards, along with a copy of the orphan train manifest Pike had obtained through his own channels at the railroad office. In the Mexican quarter, where the houses were smaller and built of adobe and the streets narrower and less maintained, tension had been building for weeks. On the fourth day after Jonas's arrival, it boiled over in violence that surprised no one who had been paying attention. A farmhand named Miguel Herrera, the same man whose daughter had vanished, was dragged from his shack before dawn by a group of 5 cowboys who claimed he had stolen a white girl from a homestead outside town. The accusation was baseless, fueled by whiskey and racial hatred and the need for a scapegoat, someone to punish for crimes no one in power wanted to investigate. But it was enough to gather a mob. "No, por favor," Miguel screamed in Spanish as they hauled him into the street, his words rapid and desperate. "I have done nothing. I search for my own daughter. Please, I have done nothing." But the cowboys were not listening because they had never intended to listen. They had a rope, and they had permission from men like Kensington who wanted distractions, who wanted the Mexican and Apache populations frightened and compliant. Chato, watching from the shadows of a rooftop where he had bedded down for the night, wrapped in a blanket against the cold, saw them haul Miguel into the street. The man was pleading in Spanish, his words tumbling over each other. But the cowboys laughed and called him a liar. And worse things, their voices ugly with hate. Chato acted without thinking, driven by memory and rage, and the knowledge that if he did nothing, a man would die for the crime of being brown and powerless. He shoved a full water barrel off the edge of the roof where it had been stored against winter freezes. It crashed into the street below, splintering into 1,000 pieces and sending water flooding across the packed dirt in a great wave. 2 cowboys went down hard, slipping and cursing and spitting mud. In the chaos that followed, a rifle discharged not from Chato's hand, but from the panicked, drunken reaction of a cowboy named Peters, who had his finger on the trigger when he fell. The bullet went wild, ricocheting off a wall, and caught a young boy who had come out to see what the noise was about. The child, maybe 10 years old, one of Mary's former students, screamed as the bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the dirt. The mob scattered like quail at the sound of the scream, and the sight of the blood, suddenly sober and terrified of what they had done, of how it would look, of the consequences that might actually fall on them this time. They ran, leaving Miguel gasping and sobbing in the dirt, his wrists bloody from the rope, and the boy bleeding and crying for his mother. Chato dropped from the roof, landing in a crouch, and knelt in the dust beside the groaning boy. He pressed his hand hard to the wound, applying pressure the way his grandmother had taught him, the way his people had learned through generations of warfare and survival. The boy's eyes were wide with shock and pain, his breath coming in hitching gasps. "Shh," Chato murmured in Spanish, one of the few phrases he knew. "Ayuda viene," help comes. "This was not my bullet," he said aloud in Apache, but the words sounded hollow, even to him, an excuse that carried no weight. If he had not acted, Miguel would be dead. But now a child was wounded, and the balance was not clear, and he did not know if he had done right or simply traded one tragedy for another. Dr. Pike arrived within minutes, summoned by someone's shout, his bag in hand, and his face set with determination. He took over smoothly, his hands quick and sure as he examined the wound, packed it with clean cloth, and lifted the boy with surprising strength for a man his age. "Get out of here," he hissed at Chato without looking at him. "Before they come back and blame you for this too. They'll hang you just to have someone to punish, and it won't matter that you saved Miguel." Chato vanished into the dawn, like smoke slipping between buildings and over walls, heading back toward Elise's lean-to through a route he had memorized on his first night in town. Later that same day, Pike brought Elise another piece of news, this one quieter and more personal, delivered in his surgery, with the door closed and locked. "I need to tell you something," Pike said gently, sitting across from her in the dim room while Jonas slept in a basket. "After I examined you when Johan died, I found scarring. Significant scarring from the birth. The tearing was worse than I realized at the time, and it didn't heal properly. There's damage to your womb, Elise." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's very likely you won't be able to carry another child. The risk would be too high, both for you and for any baby. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner, but you were grieving, and I thought I should wait." The words landed without drama, just a dull, final weight that settled in her chest, like a stone dropped into a well, falling and falling, until it hit bottom. Elise absorbed them in silence, staring at her hands, at the calluses, and the cuts that never quite healed. She thought of Johan, of the hope she had carried and lost, of the emptiness that had followed. Then she looked at Jonas, asleep in his basket, with his small fists curled against his cheeks, and said, "That doesn't change what we have to do. If anything, it makes it plainer. This child needs me, and I need him. Maybe this is why Johan died. So I would be here for Jonas. So I would say yes when Chato asked." Pike nodded slowly, his eyes sad, but understanding. "Then we make sure he survives this. And we make sure Kensington pays for every child he's taken." The three of them, widow Dr. Warrior, formed a plan over the next 2 days, meeting in secret after dark in Pike's surgery, speaking in low voices while Mary kept watch at the window. The railroad, under pressure from the territorial government in Santa Fe after reports of missing orphans had finally reached the right ears, had demanded a surprise inspection of Kensington's freight operations and mine tunnels. Kensington, unwilling to refuse outright and risk exposing his entire operation, had agreed to a compromise. He would move his orphans to an old ventilation shaft at Red Hollow, a canyon across the river, for a private handoff to a supposed buyer from California who had paid in advance and wanted no publicity. The plan was dangerous but simple. Chato would intercept the convoy in the canyon and free the children before they could be handed over and lost forever. Elise, with Mary and Pike, would remain in town to rally support and force the territorial judge's hand once the freed children arrived as living evidence. But to make the case stick in a court of law, they needed one more thing: Kensington's ledger, the physical proof of his crimes written in his own hand. Pike had a contact in the telegraph office, a young clerk named Thomas Whitmore, who owed him a profound debt after Pike had saved his wife during a difficult childbirth that would have killed both mother and child without intervention. Thomas had agreed to send a wire to the territorial judge in Santa Fe, requesting an emergency inquiry into the missing orphans. He had sent the wire 3 days ago, and they were waiting for a response. We get the ledger, we get the children, we get justice, Mary said fiercely, her green eyes flashing in the lamplight as they huddled around Pike's table. All at once, or not at all. If we move too soon, Kensington burns the evidence and the children disappear. Too late, and the same thing happens. The timing has to be perfect. Or we all hang. Pike added quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood the stakes completely. 2 days before the planned convoy, on a Thursday evening when the sun was setting red and angry behind the mountains, Dr. Pike did not come to their meeting. Elise and Mary waited in the surgery, the silent stretching taut between them, punctuated only by the ticking of Pike's clock on the wall. An hour passed, and then 2. Finally, Mary went to look for him, her face set with worry. She returned 15 minutes later, pale and shaking, supporting Pike, who was bleeding from a cut above his eye, his clothes disheveled and torn. What happened? Elise gasped, rushing to help him into a chair. Thomas. Pike said, his voice thick with pain and rage. The clerk. I went to check on him to see if the judge had responded. Found him in his office. Dead. Neck broken, the telegraph key smashed to pieces. The office ransacked. Chatto, who had been waiting in the shadows, as always stepped forward. Kensington. Kensington. Pike confirmed, his hands shaking as he pressed a cloth to his bleeding head. But worse. I saw him leaving the telegraph office. I confronted him in the alley, demanded to know what he'd done. He didn't deny it. He smiled and said, "The boy talked too much. Loose ends are dangerous in business." Then he had Black Jack hit me and leave me in the dirt. They took the ledger from my coat. I'd been carrying a copy of the manifest there, and they got that too. Elise felt the room tilt, adrenaline surging through her blood like ice water. He killed Thomas himself. Put his hands around the boy's neck and snapped it like a twig. Pike said, his voice hollow. Black Jack told me so while he was hitting me. Said I should learn from Thomas's example and keep my mouth shut if I wanted to live long enough to enjoy retirement. Mary's face was white with rage. That murdering bastard. But worse news was coming. A knock at the door made them all freeze. Chatto's knife was in his hand instantly, but it was only Yale Cutter, the deputy, looking grim and uncomfortable. Dr. Pike, Yale said, not stepping inside. I need to inform you that Kensington has filed a complaint. Says you attacked him in the street tonight, made wild accusations about murdered children. He's pressing charges. I'm supposed to bring you in for questioning. You know that's a lie. Pike said, his voice cold. What I know doesn't matter. Yale replied, and there was something in his voice that might have been shame. What I can prove matters. And right now, all I've got is Kensington's word against yours, and he's got witnesses. Black Jack and 2 others say they saw you start the fight. Pike stood slowly swaying. Fine, take me in. But you know what he's doing, Yale. You know children are missing. How many more have to die before you grow a spine? Yale's face hardened. Watch yourself, Doc. I'm trying to help you here. After Yale led Pike away, promising he would only hold him overnight and let him go in the morning if Kensington didn't push the matter. Elise, Mary, and Chatto were left in the surgery, the walls seeming to close in. He's moving faster than we are, Mary said, her voice tight. He's cleaned up the telegraph connection, silenced the one man who could testify about the wire to Santa Fe, and now he's neutralizing Pike. We're out of time. And we don't have the ledger. Elise added, the weight of failure pressing down on her. Then we get it. Chatto said, his voice flat and certain. Tonight, before he can move it or burn it. That's suicide, Mary protested. His office is right on Main Street, and he's got men watching it. Then we do not go through the front door. Chato replied. Every building has weaknesses. Every man gets careless when he thinks he has won. They spent the next 2 hours sketching a rough map of Kensington's office and the buildings around it. At midnight, Chato slipped out into the darkness, moving like a ghost through the empty streets toward the finest building in town. Kensington's office was dark, but Chato could see a faint glow from the back room where the safe was kept. He climbed to the roof of the adjacent building, crossed the gap with a jump that made his wounded shoulders scream in protest, and lowered himself to Kensington's window. The lock was good, but not good enough. He slipped a thin blade between the frame and the sill, worked it carefully, and felt the latch give. Inside, he moved through the darkness, with the certainty of a man who had spent his life in places he was not supposed to be. The ledger sat on Kensington's desk, bold and arrogant, as if the man believed no one would dare touch it. Chato took it and turned to leave, and froze. Kensington stood in the doorway, a pistol in his hand, and a smile on his face. "I knew you'd come," Kensington said pleasantly. "The Apache who thinks he's clever. Mary O'Rourke's little spy. Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out?" He stepped into the room, keeping the pistol trained on Chato's chest. "You see, I have insurance. I have men who watch the watchers, and I have something else you want." He whistled, and Blackjack entered from the back room carrying Jonas wrapped in a blanket. The baby was crying, his face red and furious. Elise's blood turned to ice when Chato told her later what had happened next. Kensington had taken Jonas from Mary while she was walking back from the well that evening, Blackjack grabbing the baby and Mary both. Mary had fought, earning a pistol whip across the temple that left her bleeding and unconscious in the alley where Pike had found her after he escaped Yale's custody. "You want the baby and the ledger," Kensington had said to Chato. "Come to Red Hollow tomorrow at noon. Bring the widow, or the baby goes west with the others on the afternoon freight and you'll never see him again. And just so we're clear, I've already moved the children. They're not where you think they are. You intercept the wrong wagon, the baby dies. You don't show up, the baby dies. You bring the law, the baby dies. The only way he lives is if you come alone and do exactly what I say." Chato had no choice. He lowered the knife and watched Kensington take the ledger back, watched Blackjack carry Jonas out into the night. When he returned to the surgery and told Elise and Mary what had happened, Elise felt her world crack apart. But then she remembered the breathing in for 4, hold for 2, out for 4, and forced her panic down until it was a cold, hard thing she could use. "Then we go," she said. But not the way he expects. They planned through the night, desperate and dangerous. Chato would approach from the canyon rim as Kensington expected, but Elise would come from a different direction, using a narrow trail Mary knew from her childhood explorations. Mary would stay behind, rounding up every parent who had lost a child and bringing them to Main Street at dawn, making noise and demanding answers, creating a spectacle that would force Yale to act or reveal himself as complicit. And if they failed, at least they would fail fighting. The next morning, Friday, November 1st, 1878, dawned cold and clear, the kind of sharp autumn day that cut through thin fabric and made breath visible. Elise, dressed in her plainest clothes, the brown dress she had worn to Walter's funeral, and strapped Walter's old Colt to her hip beneath her skirt, where it pressed cold and heavy against her leg. Chato was already gone, moving through the desert before dawn, like smoke that left no trail. Red Hollow was a slash of shadow in the red rock, a narrow canyon carved by ancient water and wind, the walls rising steep on either side. Elise arrived just before noon, her mouth dry and her heart steady from the breathing exercises she had practiced all the way there, counting in her head, forcing her body to obey. She could taste dust and fear, metallic and sharp, on her tongue. Kensington stood at the mouth of the canyon, Blackjack beside him, looking smug and violent, and in Kensington's arms, Jonas cried and squirmed, his small face red with fury and fear. Behind them, a freight wagon sat loaded and ready. And through the wooden slats, Elise could see children's faces, pale, frightened, watching with the hollow eyes of those who had given up hope. "Mrs. Kruger." Kensington called his voice pleasant, as if they were meeting at a church social. "I'm glad you came. Punctual. I appreciate that in people. Where's your Apache friend?" "He's not my friend," Elise lied, keeping her voice flat and emotionless. "He forced me to hide the baby. Threatened me. I just want the child safe and this nightmare over. I'll testify that he took him, that he killed those people at the wagon. Just let the baby go." Kensington smiled, but it did not reach his eyes, which were cold and calculating. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. You see, you've become a problem, Mrs. Kruger. You and that meddling doctor and that Irish bitch who won't stay in her place. Problems need to be solved, and I've built my fortune on solving problems efficiently." He nodded to Black Jack, who drew his pistol with a smooth, practiced motion. Elise dove to the side as the first shot cracked the air with a sound enormous in the narrow canyon, echoing off the walls. She rolled behind a boulder, her shoulder hitting hard stone, pain shooting through her arm. Her pulse raced, but she kept breathing in for 4, hold out for 4, and drew her Colt with shaking hands that steadied as she gripped the weapon. From the canyon rim above, a rifle shot rang out. Chatto's Winchester barked once, twice, the shots precise and deliberate. The first took Black Jack in the shoulder, spinning him around with the impact. He dropped his pistol and fell to his knees, cursing in a stream of profanity that echoed off the rocks. But Kensington did not panic. He was a man who always had a backup plan, who always thought 3 moves ahead. He pulled Jonas tighter against his chest, using the baby's small body as a shield, and backed toward the wagon where 2 more of his men waited with rifles. "Nice try," Kensington shouted toward the canyon rim. "But you won't risk the child, and we both know it. I've got 6 men here and more coming. You're outnumbered and outgunned." From inside the wagon, a voice shouted in Spanish, "Ahora, ahora." The children inside, older ones 10 and 12 and 14, who had been listening and planning while their captors grew complacent, kicked open the back gate with a coordinated effort. They swarmed out, like angry hornets, throwing rocks they had collected from the canyon floor, screaming and creating chaos. One boy, braver or more desperate than the rest, a Mexican child named Carlos, who had been taken from his home 3 weeks earlier, grabbed Kensington's leg and bit down hard on his thigh, his teeth breaking through fabric and skin. Kensington howled and dropped Jonas in shock and pain. The baby tumbled toward the hard ground, and Elise, moving faster than she thought possible, driven by pure instinct and desperation, lunged forward from behind her boulder. She caught Jonas against her chest, rolling to absorb the impact, feeling the breath knocked from her lungs as she hit the ground, with the baby cradled safely against her. Chatto dropped from the canyon wall in a controlled fall, landing hard but steady his shoulder, screaming in protest as old wounds tore open. He tackled Kensington to the dirt before the man could recover, and they struggled fists and elbows and knees until Chatto pinned him and pressed a knife to his throat, hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "Move and you die." Chatto hissed, his voice cold as winter wind. Black Jack, wounded and bleeding but not dead, tried to rise his good hand, reaching for a hideout pistol in his boot. Elise, still on the ground with Jonas in one arm, pointed her Colt at him with the other hand. Both arms extended, her breath steady despite the chaos. "Don't," she said, her voice cold and certain, and he saw something in her eyes that made him freeze and slowly raise his empty hand. He stayed down. The children scattered into the canyon, some running for freedom toward the desert beyond, others staying close to Elise and Chatto, clustering around the adults who had come for them. The Mexican girl who had shouted the signal, a 14-year-old named Elena Herrera, knelt beside Elise, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "Gracias," she whispered in broken English, her voice thick with emotion. "Mi hermano, my brother Carlos, he is here. We thought no one would come. We thought we would die in the dark places." But the fight was not over. From the far end of the canyon, the sound of hoofbeats echoed off the walls, growing louder. More riders appeared, 6 of Kensington's men summoned by the sound of gunfire and the plan they had rehearsed. They were armed and angry and paid well enough to be loyal. "We have to move," Chato said, hauling Kensington to his feet and using him as a human shield, the knife still pressed to his throat. Now, they retreated up the canyon, driving the children ahead of them, like a desperate shepherd with wolves at his heels, with bullets kicking up dust at their heels and ricocheting off the stone walls with high whining sounds. It was a running fight, desperate and chaotic, until they reached a narrow pass where the walls closed in and the riders could not follow easily without dismounting and becoming easy targets. There they made their stand, and there everything changed. Yale Cutter arrived with a hastily assembled posse of 10 men, not all of them Kensington's employees. Word had spread through town that morning, thanks to Mary's efforts. She had gone door to door in the pre-dawn darkness, waking parents, showing them her notebook, telling them their children might still be alive. By sunrise, Main Street had been filled with angry, grieving parents, demanding answers and justice. Yale, seeing which way the wind was finally blowing after years of looking the other way, chose survival and maybe a shred of redemption over loyalty to a man who had just become a liability. "Drop your weapons," Yale shouted at Kensington's men. "It's over." But Kensington's foreman, a man named Sledge, who had been with him since the beginning and knew too much to ever be safe if Kensington fell, raised his rifle instead. A gunfight erupted in the canyon, bullets flying in all directions, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. In the chaos, Sledge made a desperate move. He pulled something from his saddlebags, the ledger which Kensington had given him to burn if things went wrong, and tried to throw it into a small fire the men had built earlier to brew coffee. The flames licked at the leather binding as the book tumbled through the air. But Yale, moving with surprising speed for a man his age, dove and caught it before it could land in the flames. He hit the ground hard, the ledger clutched to his chest and rolled away from the fire. A bullet from Sledge's rifle grazed his leg, but he held on to the book. "I've got it," Yale shouted. "I've got the proof." The fight ended quickly after that. Kensington's men, seeing their boss captured and the ledger saved, began to surrender one by one. They were hired guns, not fanatics, and they had no desire to hang for someone else's crimes. Sledge tried to run, spurring his horse deeper into the canyon, but Chato's rifle barked once, and the man fell from his saddle wounded but alive. Kensington, his face twisted with rage and disbelief, was dragged away in chains by Yale's men. Black Jack, wounded and defeated, went quietly, his swagger gone. But the cost was high. As the dust settled and the ringing in their ears faded, Elise realized she was bleeding. A bullet had grazed her left side during the fight, tearing through her dress and leaving a long, burning furrow across her ribs. She had not even felt it in the chaos, the adrenaline masking the pain. But now, it hit her all at once. "Elise?" Chato saw the blood and caught her as her knees buckled. Jonas, miraculously unharmed, cried in her arms. "I'm fine," she said, though the world was spinning. "Is he safe? Is Jonas safe?" "He is safe," Chato said, his voice rough with emotion he did not usually show. "You saved him. Now let me save you." He tore a strip from his shirt and bound her wound tightly, his hands gentle despite their roughness. The pain was fierce, but she focused on her breathing in for 4, hold out for 4, and stayed conscious. Chato himself was in no better shape. The fall from the canyon rim and the fight with Kensington had torn open the wound in his side from the earlier shooting, and blood seeped through his shirt in an expanding stain. His face was pale beneath the sun-darkened skin, and his hands shook slightly as he worked on Elise's bandage. "You're bleeding too," Elise said, her voice weak. "Later," he replied. "First, we get you and the children to safety." The children, 15 of them in total ranging in age from 2 to 14, were loaded into wagons confiscated from Kensington's men and brought back to Dusty Fork under guard. By the time they arrived, the sun was setting, and the town had turned out to watch lining Main Street in a silent, somber crowd. Elena Herrera, the Mexican girl who had organized the children's rebellion in the wagon, stood at the front of the group, her chin high and her eyes fierce. Her brother Carlos stood beside her, his hand in hers, both of them bruised and thin, but alive. Dr. Pike, released from custody when Yale saw which way the wind was blowing, met them at the edge of town. He took one look at Elise and Chato and started barking orders, organizing the wounded into his surgery with the help of Mary and several townswomen who had suddenly remembered their Christian charity. That night, as Pike stitched Elise's wound and cleaned Chato's reopened injuries, the full story began to emerge through the testimony of the children and the examination of the ledger Yale had saved. 3 days later, on Monday, November 4th, 1878, the territorial judge arrived on a dusty coach from Santa Fe, drawn by the flurry of telegrams sent by Yale this time on his own authority, and the rumors that had spread like wildfire across the territory and even reached the newspapers in Denver and St. Louis. Judge Abner Stillwell was a gray-haired man in his 60s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a reputation for fairness that had survived 20 years on the territorial bench. He held court in the meeting hall at the edge of town, a large room usually used for dances and town meetings, now packed with people standing shoulder to shoulder. Chato did not sit among the townsfolk. His wound had been stitched by Dr. Pike with careful precision, but it still pained him, and he moved with deliberate slowness. He watched from the shade of a cottonwood tree outside, visible through the open windows, close enough to hear every word, but far enough to remind everyone that his people were not under this roof by choice or by citizenship. Inside, the air was thick with tension and the smell of unwashed bodies and nervous sweat. Mary, her head still bandaged from Blackjack's assault, testified, first reading from her notebook in a clear, carrying voice. She gave the names and stories of missing children, the dates they had vanished, the inadequate responses from the authorities. Her Irish accent grew thicker as her anger rose, but every word was precise and damning. Dr. Pike followed, presenting the copy of the orphan train manifest he had obtained, and the medical notes he had kept, including his examination of Jonas and the matching birthmark that confirmed the child's identity. He also testified about the contaminated water, Kensington's refusal to address it, and the deaths that had resulted, including Johann Kruger. Then the children themselves spoke one by one, their voices shaking but determined. Elena Herrera stood before the judge with her brother Carlos beside her, her hand gripping his tightly. "We were on the train from New York," she said in careful English, each word deliberate and practiced. "My brother and me, we are going to a family in Santa Fe. Papers signed, everything legal. But the train, it stops at Crow Wing. Men come, men who work for Kensington. They say there is problem that we must go in wagons instead because the train is broken. But the train is not broken. We are put in wagons with chains. They drive us to the canyon, keep us in the dark. My brother Carlos, he tries to fight. They beat him until he stops moving. I think he is dead. But he wakes up later." Her voice cracked, but she did not cry. "They tell us we are going to work in mines, in kitchens, in places where no one will find us. They say if we tell anyone, they will kill our families back in Mexico. We believe them. But then the lady comes, the German lady, and the Apache, and they fight for us. So I will fight too. I will tell the truth. Carlos, who was only 9 and spoke less English, added in Spanish, which Mary translated, "The men, they laugh when we cry. They say we are worth money like horses or cows. They say no one cares about Mexican children or Apache children or poor white children. But I care. My sister cares. And these people who saved us, they care. So the men are wrong." One by one, the other children gave similar testimony, their voices building a wall of evidence that could not be denied or dismissed. An Apache boy named Two Horses, who had worked at the livery, spoke through an interpreter about being grabbed on his way home and locked in a freight car. A white girl named Sarah Mitchell, 10 years old, described being offered candy by a man in a wagon and then finding herself chained in a tunnel beneath the mine. Their words painted a picture of systematic abuse and trafficking that had been going on for at least 2 years, maybe longer. The judge examined Kensington's ledger page by page, his face growing darker with each entry. The pattern was undeniable, names reduced to initials, destinations written in code, payments recorded in careful detail. The keyhole symbol Elise had noticed turned out to mark children who had been permanently placed, a euphemism for sold to buyers who wanted no records and no questions. Children who would never be found. Dates matched disappearances. Sums matched known transactions with mines and work camps across the territory. There were even notes in the margins about product quality and future inventory needs that turned Elise's stomach when Yale read them aloud. Kensington, his wrist still bandaged from the wound Elise had given him weeks earlier, and his thigh wrapped from Carlos's bite, tried to argue his innocence. He stood in chains before the judge, his soft hands cuffed in front of him, his voice still smooth and practiced despite the circumstances. "I am a businessman, Your Honor." He said each word carefully chosen. "I operated freight contracts in good faith. If some of those contracts were with unscrupulous men who misrepresented their intentions, how was I to know? I trusted the railroad's vetting process. I trusted the authorities. I am as much a victim here as anyone betrayed by those I employed." The judge cut him off with a sharp gesture, his patience exhausted. "You sold children, Mr. Kensington." Stillwell said, his voice cold as winter iron. "You falsified records. You murdered a telegraph operator to cover your crimes. We found his blood on your cufflinks, which were recovered from your office. You obstructed a federal railway inspection through bribery and intimidation. You poisoned a town's water supply through negligence and greed, causing the deaths of at least 3 infants that Dr. Pike can document. The only question before this court is whether you hang for it or spend the rest of your natural life in the territorial prison, breaking the same rocks your victims once broke for you." Kensington's face went white, all the color draining away. "You can't. I have rights. I demand a proper trial with a jury of my peers." "You'll get your trial," the judge said. "And when it's over, you'll hang or you'll rot. Either way, there is more than enough evidence, murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, fraud, and violations of the territorial laws governing orphans and the children placed in your care. Bail is denied. You're remanded to custody pending trial." He struck his gavel, the sound sharp and final. Black Jack and the guards who had helped Kensington received similar treatment, bound over for trial with bail denied. Sledge, wounded in the canyon fight, was charged with attempted destruction of evidence and assault. Several of Kensington's business associates, including men who ran the freight office and managed the telegraph, were fined heavily and barred from holding public contracts or positions of trust. The mine was placed under territorial oversight, and new safety measures were implemented immediately, with a territorial inspector assigned to enforce them. The trials were held over the next 2 weeks, and they were swift. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony heartbreaking. Kensington was sentenced to hang, and the execution was carried out on a cold morning in late November, with half the town watching in grim, satisfied silence. Black Jack received a life sentence of hard labor. Sledge got 20 years. The railroad, desperate to avoid a federal investigation and potential lawsuits from grieving families across the country, agreed to fund a proper orphanage for the recovered children, with Mary O'Rourke appointed as the official director at a salary that would allow her to work full-time. The building they constructed was modest, but solid, built on the site of one of Kensington's confiscated properties, with clean water from a new well. Dr. Pike insisted be dug far from the contaminated mine runoff, tested regularly by an independent assayer. Elise spent the weeks of recovery in a small room above Dr. Pike's surgery, her wound healing slowly under his careful attention. Jonas thrived, growing stronger every day, his cries becoming more indignant and demanding as health returned. Chatto recovered more slowly, his wound having been deeper and more dangerous, and he remained in the livery loft, where Pike could check on him daily. One evening, 2 weeks after the trials ended, when Elise's wound had healed enough for her to walk without pain, she climbed the ladder to the livery loft, where Chatto was mending a piece of tack by lamplight. He looked up as she entered, surprise flickering across his face. "I wanted to return this," she said, holding out Walter's ring, which she had carried in her pocket since the trial. "You dropped it during the fight in the canyon. I found it in the dirt afterward." Chatto took it slowly, turning it over in his fingers. "Your husband's," he said. "Yes." Elise sat down on a hay bale, arranging her skirts carefully. He was a good man, but not a strong one. The kind of man who worked hard and tried to do right, but got ground down by men like Kensington. He wanted to build something here, a farm and a family and a future. But he died before we could even start. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Walter used to tell me about his father, about the old man's belief that a man's worth was measured by what he built, not by what he owned. He said his father built a life in Prussia with nothing but his hands and his honor, and that was enough. Walter wanted to do the same here, but the land was harder and the men were crueler, and he just wore out. Chatto listened in silence, his dark eyes steady on her face. "I don't know what we're doing here." Elise continued, her voice soft but certain. "I don't know what you want or what I want or what any of this means. But I know that when I was lying in that canyon bleeding and thinking I might die, the only thing I could think about was making sure Jonas was safe. And the only person I trusted to do that was you. You barely know me," Chatto said quietly. "I know you carried a baby out of fire," Elise replied. "I know you taught me how to breathe when fear would have killed me. I know you stood beside me when running would have been easier and safer. I know you got wounded protecting children who weren't yours and didn't owe you anything. That's enough." She held out her hand. After a long moment, Chatto took it, his rough palm warm against hers. "I am afraid." He admitted the words, clearly difficult for a man who had spent his life showing no weakness. "I am afraid that if I stay, I bring danger to you and the child. My people are hunted. The army looks for reasons to attack. If they know I am here living among whites, they may come. And I am afraid that if I go, I will lose something I did not know I needed." "Then stay," Elise said, "and we'll face the danger together. That's what family does." The word hung between them, fragile and new and full of possibility. When Jonas's legal status finally came before Judge Stillwell 3 weeks after Kensington's execution, the courtroom was packed with townsfolk, curious to see how the matter would be settled and whether the territorial government would do the right thing or the expedient thing. Elise sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Despite the pain it caused her healing wound, her heart pounding steady and strong from weeks of practice with the breathing exercises. Chatto stood in the back near the door, as always, his wound still tender, but healing, ready to leave if the decision went badly, but hoping for the first time in years that it might go right. The judge rubbed his eyes and sighed. A man weary of difficult decisions, but determined to make them anyway. The child designated as Jonas, believed to be the infant son of Friedrich, and Anna Holtz, deceased, has no surviving white kin on record, according to the railroad's investigation. He said, his voice carrying through the silent room. The adults from the wagon are dead. The boy who might have known the family's destination and relatives is dead. That makes the child, by law, a ward of the territory to be placed as this court sees fit. Dr. Pike rose from his seat, his face set with determination and his hands steady. Your Honor, if I may present additional evidence. He produced the tin box that had been found with Jonas, in the burned wagon, the one Chato had given to Elise, and she had kept safe through everything. Inside were the brooch, the lock of hair, and the folded page torn from a boarding pass. Pike unfolded the paper carefully and read aloud. For Elise and Walter Kruger, who shared their bread with us all the way from Bremen and treated us like family when we had none. You are like sister to me now, Elise. If something happens to us on this journey west, please remember us. Please remember our son. His name is Johann Friedrich Holtz. We named him for your boy too because we hoped they would grow up together. With love and hope, Anna Holtz. The date was from 3 years earlier during the ocean crossing. The courtroom was silent. Elise felt tears streaming down her face, tears she had not allowed herself to cry through all the violence and fear. They crossed the ocean together. Pike said, his voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Kruger and this child's mother were friends. They shared food and stories and hope when they had nothing else. They named their children for each other. If that's not family, Your Honor, then the word has no meaning. And if we're going to rebuild this town on something other than greed and violence, we need to start recognizing that family is what we choose, not just what we're born to. The judge considered the note for a long time, reading it again silently, turning it over in his hands. Elena Herrera, sitting with her brother Carlos in the second row, spoke up suddenly in her careful English. She saved us, Your Honor. The German lady and the Apache. They came when no one else would. They fought when everyone else looked away. That baby, he is lucky to have them. More lucky than any paper can make him. Several of the other children nodded, and their words seemed to carry weight that legal arguments could not. Finally, Judge Stillwell looked up at Elise, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Kruger, he said, do you wish to be named legal guardian of this child? I do, Your Honor, Elise said, her voice firm despite the tears, more than anything. Very well. The court, based on the evidence of prior relationship and the clear intent of the deceased mother, names Elisa Kruger, legal guardian of the child Johann Friedrich Holtz, to be called Jonas Holtz Kruger, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. He paused, his gaze flicking to the back of the room where Chato stood in the shadows. However, I must address the elephant in this courtroom. It has come to my attention that Mrs. Kruger has been living in close proximity to an Apache man named Chato, and there is some question about the propriety of this arrangement. The room tensed. Elise felt her breath catch, but she forced it steady. Your Honor, she said, standing, Chato saved my life and this child's life. He has shown more honor and courage than most white men I have met. If you're asking whether I intend to continue associating with him, the answer is yes. And if you're asking whether I intend to marry him so that this child has 2 parents instead of 1, the answer is also yes, if he'll have me. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps. Chato's face showed shock, then something that might have been hope. The judge held up his hand for silence. Mrs. Kruger, I appreciate your honesty, though I'm not sure I appreciate your timing. However, I must warn you, if you leave this territory with the child, the army will take an interest. They will claim the child is being kidnapped or endangered, and they will use it as an excuse to pursue and potentially harm Mr. Chatto and his people. Do you understand? I understand, Elise said. We're not leaving. This is our home now, such as it is. We'll stay and make it better. The judge nodded slowly. Then the court has no objection to your personal arrangements, unconventional though they may be. The child is yours, Mrs. Kruger. Raise him well. Raise him to be better than what this town has been. He struck his gavel. So ordered. This court is adjourned. After the hearing, as the crowd filed out into the bright afternoon, some people muttering disapproval and others nodding quiet support, Elise found Chatto outside under the cottonwood tree. He was standing with his arms crossed, his face carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Did you mean what you said in there? He asked quietly. Every word, Elise replied. But only if you want it. I won't trap you with words spoken in a courtroom. Chatto was silent for a long moment, staring out at the desert beyond the town. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out Walter's ring, which Elise had returned to him weeks earlier. In my culture, he said slowly, marriage is not done with rings and churches. It is done with promises spoken before the people, promises to provide and protect and stand together when the world turns hard. I do not know your German customs or your Christian rules. But I know that what I feel when I see you with that child, when I remember you standing in that canyon with a gun in your hand and fear in your eyes, but courage in your heart. I know that is what my grandmother called the bond that chooses us. He held out the ring. I cannot wear this. It is not my way. But if you will teach me your customs, and I will teach you mine, and we will build something that belongs to both of us and neither of us, then I will stand with you. Not as your savior or your servant, but as your partner. Is that marriage in your world? Yes. Elise said, tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were different tears. Yes, that's exactly what marriage should be. They stood like that for a long moment. And then in front of half the town and all the watching eyes, Chatto pulled her into an embrace that was not tactical or desperate, but chosen, deliberate, and full of promise. Mary O'Rourke, watching from the doorway of the meeting hall with a grin on her face, turned to Dr. Pike. Well, that's the most romantic thing I've ever seen in this godforsaken town, she said. It's about time something good happened here, Pike replied, and he was smiling too. They walked up the hill together that evening, woman warrior and child, to stand once more beside Johann's small grave. The sky burned in streaks of orange and violet, and the air was cold enough to see their breath. Jonas slept peacefully in Chatto's arms, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill. Elise knelt and placed a smooth riverstone on the grave, a marker that would last longer than flowers. Thank you, she whispered to the son she had lost, for teaching me how to love something so much that losing it almost killed me. Now I know how to love again, and I will not waste it. Your name will live on in another boy, and he will know that he is loved by 2 mothers and 2 fathers, living and dead. Behind her, Chatto waited with the patience of a man who understood grief. When she rose, he wrapped his free arm around her shoulders, and they stood together, the 3 of them framed against the dying light. A traveling photographer passing through Dusty Fork 2 years later would capture an image that would survive long after the people in it were gone. The photograph showed a man in traditional Apache dress standing beside a woman in a simple but clean dress, and between them a boy of 3 with serious eyes and sun-darkened skin held in the man's arms as if he were the most precious thing in the world. He could not keep the whole broken world from touching them, no one could. But the photograph captured the truth that mattered. They had chosen to stand together, and that choice had made all the difference. The town of Dusty Fork never forgot what happened in the autumn of 1878. Some people still muttered when they passed Chato and Elise in the street, their eyes sliding away, their mouths tight with disapproval of a cross-cultural marriage that defied convention. Others nodded respectfully, remembering the children who had been saved, and the courage it had taken to stand against a powerful man who thought himself untouchable. Mary O'Rourke ran her orphanage with fierce determination and an iron hand softened by genuine love. She placed every child in a home that would not break them, and she kept careful records so that no child would ever be lost or forgotten again. She became known throughout the territory as a woman who would fight for the powerless, and her Wayhouse became a model for others. Dr. Pike continued his work, his surgery door always open to those who needed him, regardless of their ability to pay or the color of their skin. He trained 2 younger doctors over the next decade, passing on his knowledge and his commitment to healing rather than profit. The contaminated mine shaft was sealed, and a new well was dug under his supervision. Over the next 5 years, far fewer infants died in Dusty Fork. Yale Cutter, who had found his spine at the last possible moment, remained deputy, but with a new reputation. He was no longer the man who looked the other way when convenient, but the man who had caught the ledger and saved the evidence that brought down a tyrant. He never became a hero exactly, but he became trustworthy, and in a frontier town that was worth more than gold. On the edge of town, where the fence met the open desert and the wind blew free across the scrubland, a house stood. It was built over the course of a year, constructed by Apache hands, with lumber purchased with money Elise earned, taking in sewing and laundry, furnished with German practicality, and decorated with symbols from both cultures. There was a cross on one wall and a woven blanket with traditional Apache patterns on another, a testament to the blending of 2 worlds that had seemed irreconcilable. The house raising became a community event, though not everyone participated. Some townspeople stayed away, clinging to their prejudices. But others came to help, including several Mexican families who remembered that Chato had saved Miguel Herrera from a lynch mob, and the children from the orphanage who carried water and held tools and sang songs in 3 languages. Inside that house, a child grew tall and strong, learning 2 languages fluently and 2 ways of seeing the world. Jonas learned to track deer from his father and to read books from his mother. He learned the breathing technique that steadied fear and the patience that won difficult battles. He learned that family was not blood or law or paper. It was the willingness to stand at the door every single day and say, "This is mine to protect." He also learned the stories of his 2 mothers, Anna, who had died trying to give him a better life, and Elise, who had chosen him when she had every reason to turn away. And he learned about Johann, the brother he had never met, but whose name he carried like a sacred trust. Jonas Holtz Kruger never doubted that he was loved. When children at school mocked him for his mixed family, he stood straighter and recited the facts. His father had saved 15 children from slavery, and his mother had shot a man who tried to use a baby as a shield. The mockery usually stopped after that. On a warm evening in the spring of 1884, when Jonas was 6 years old and tall for his age, Elise and Chato sat on the porch they had built together, watching the boy play in the dust with a wooden horse Chato had carved for him. The horse had taken 3 weeks to make every detail perfect, and Jonas treasured it above all his possessions. "Do you ever regret it?" Elise asked quietly, her hand resting on Chato's knee in the casual intimacy of long partnership. "Staying here in this place that does not always welcome you or treat you with the respect you deserve." Chato was silent for a long moment, watching Jonas make the horse gallop across an imaginary prairie, his childish voice providing sound effects. "I regret many things," he said finally, his voice thoughtful. "I regret that I could not save Nasha, that my niece is still missing, probably dead, or sold so far away I will never find her. I regret the boy who was shot in the street because I acted without thinking of all consequences. I regret that the world is hard and cruel and unfair, that good people die for no reason and evil people prosper. He turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious and deep. But I do not regret this. I do not regret you or him, or the choice to stay and build something when leaving would have been easier and probably safer. Regret is for things done wrong. This is not wrong. This is the only thing in my life that feels entirely right. Elise leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing that she had learned to match years ago in the moonlit dust behind a lean-to. No, she agreed softly. This is not wrong. This is good. This is what we make when we choose love over fear action, over despair. They sat like that as the sun set in shades of amber and rose different from the angry red sunsets of that first terrible autumn, and Jonas's laughter echoed in the cooling air. The night settled around them like a familiar blanket, and the stars emerged one by one, cold and distant but beautiful in their constancy. 30 years later, in 1914, when Jonas Holtz Kruger was a grown man with children of his own, and his parents were aging but still strong, sat down to write their story. He had become a teacher following in Mary O'Rourke's footsteps, and he wanted his students, white, Mexican, Apache, all of them, to understand what was possible when people chose courage over convenience. My mother once told me, he wrote in careful script, that family is not defined by blood or law, but by the willingness to stand together when the world says you should stand apart. My father taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, to protect those who cannot protect themselves, even when the cost is high. I am the son of a German immigrant widow who had every reason to turn away from a stolen baby and an Apache warrior who risked everything to save children no one else valued. I am the product of their choice to love each other and to love me when the world said such love was impossible or wrong. My parents were not perfect. They made mistakes. They bore scars, physical and emotional, that never fully healed. But they built something good in a hard place, and they taught me that building is always better than destroying, that love is always stronger than hate, and that the measure of a person is not where they come from or what they look like, but what they choose to do when someone needs help, and no one else will act. This is their legacy and mine, and I hope it will be yours to choose the hard right over the easy wrong, to stand with the powerless against the powerful, and to remember that every child, stolen every injustice, ignored every act of cruelty left unchallenged, diminishes all of us. We are all responsible for each other. That is the lesson of 1878, and it remains true today. Jonas paused in his writing and looked at the photograph on his desk, his parents standing together on the porch of their house, Jonas as a young boy between them. His father's hand rested on his shoulder, his mother's arm around both of them. They were smiling, a rare thing in photographs of that era, when people usually maintained stern expressions, and the love in that image was unmistakable. He picked up his pen and added one final line. They called themselves an impossible family, but they were simply a true one, and that truth survives them and me, and will survive as long as anyone chooses to remember that love, real love, requires nothing more than the courage to say yes when the world tells you to say no.